like we've got a couple more people getting ready to join, and then we will get started here just right on time, I think. All right, well, good afternoon. For those of you that have just joined the presentation, this is Richard Long from MHA Consulting. We're going to be talking about technical disaster recovery plans today. We'll get started here, and I'm showing probably another minute at the top of the hour according to my clock. I appreciate everybody taking time today. All right. One person that's waiting to join the audio. We'll wait for them, and then we will get started. All right. Well, again, welcome everyone. We're gonna go ahead and start our presentation. Hopefully, you're all here to talk about some concepts around developing a disaster recovery plans. My name is Richard Long. I am with MHA Consulting. We'll talk a little bit about who we are. I think we'll probably have everybody muted here as we get started, but if there's any issues that occur, feel free to send a chat message. We do also have Catherine Zornelis from MHA on, who's assisting in the logistics. But we'll definitely leave some time at the end for some questions. But if something comes up that we need to pause, we can definitely do that. Again, really appreciate you all taking time out of your day, and hope that your 2017 has started off happy and you're seeing some good things. To kind of just give a quick review of MHA, we've been around for about 17 years. The consultants that we have working with us, average about 15. Many of us have significantly more than that, and the vast majority of our consultants are more senior level individuals, such as myself. We really focus on the business continuity, crisis management, and then on the technology side as well, disaster recovery, IT best practices, security, data centers, etc. I am the practice leader on the technology side, and yet also spend some time on the business continuity side, integrating with various of our consultants in making sure those occur as well. So I kind of cross both sides a little bit. We do have some compliance and risk tools that are SaaS-based that if you have any questions on, we'll be able to answer those, and we'll speak a little bit about that. You see the graphic there at the bottom called BCM metrics. That's where a lot of our SaaS tools are located, and as well as some of our compliance tools. This is just a list of the various verticals that we have worked in. You can see we've got a pretty good smattering of larger organizations across most of the verticals. Myself specifically have also worked across these verticals with several of these clients. So I think we have some good experience and have some good information as we work with the various companies and organizations that kind of fit into this overall discussion that we're going to have. Lastly, kind of from an introduction perspective on who we are, you can kind of see we really try to be as comprehensive as possible, but also tailor this to our organizations, from assessing current states of environments to strategies to actually then execution phases of developing documentation, developing those strategies, exercising and training to make sure that things are functional, and then the ongoing portion of updating and staying current. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about today. One of the big things that we're really emphasizing, especially over the last couple of years, is functional capability. And that doesn't mean business functional, that means capability, that everything that we do and we work with our clients on is intended to be functional and actionable, not just paper or just boxes that are checked for audit purposes. We want to actually be able to recover and keep the business functioning. So today, what we're going to discuss is disaster recovery plans, really more from the technology side, from the DR, the IT side of things. And one of the things, as I kick this off, I like to mention that if I say business or end users or IT, that's kind of because that's what we've used from a legacy perspective. Our perspective at MHA is that there really is no difference between the business and IT. IT is part of the business. And so when we talk about these things, sometimes I'll refer to non-IT or IT, or I will say the business. But I think it's important that we recognize that there really isn't a difference. There's a difference in responsibility, but without both, obviously the business, our organizations aren't going to function. And so I think that's one of the issues that we've seen in the past is there's sometimes an us and them view, and we really, I think it's important that we bridge that and understand that we're all trying to get to the same goal. So with that, again, we want to focus on effective types of documentation and plans. And so one of the things we'll talk about is, why are these plans and documentation necessary? What's the point, right? Which is kind of that title. What's the point, really? And people know how to do things. Also, some strategies to develop this documentation to hopefully make it a little bit easier. And then the integration with the business continuity plan. Sometimes what we see is that people have their IT plans and then their business continuity plans, and never the twain meet, and there are some gaps in between them. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then talk a little bit about, for a reliable recovery, what's really the good content? How do we want to organize that content? How can we exercise, make sure that it's accurate and functional, and then keeping things relevant, again, from the standpoint of doing this as efficiently and effectively as possible. So as we look at planning and developing documentation and plans for recovery, we really believe that it's a risk-based type of scenario, right? And this picture kind of generates that. And we're going to be kind of focusing on the readiness side of things with our plans. But in everything that we do, we need to be looking at what is the risk. We don't want to over-prepare, nor do we ever want to under-prepare. So that always keeping that risk in mind, we really feel is important. And so this balancing act kind of, for me, helps me stay focused appropriately on activities as I'm working with individuals and different clients and organizations. Real quick, as we talk about these plans, I think an overarching concept, and we know these things. This isn't anything new to anybody, but is the recovery time objective and the recovery time, a recovery point objective. I'm sorry. And from a functional perspective, distinguishing between the objective and the actual. You know, that objective word really has meaning. That's really that desired state. You know, when we do business impact assessments, or you know, we meet with people and say, how quickly do you need that up? That's the objective. The actual is what we as IT can actually provide. And often we find that those two, there is a gap between them for various reasons, but making sure that that distinguishing factor is there, that if they don't meet, that communication has occurred, and that we understand what is the actual recovery we're able to do, or what's the actual data recovery we're able to perform. So just quickly wanted to make that distinction as well. So with that, what is a disaster recovery plan? One of the things that we have found is sometimes people will look at this as a single plan. And that's appropriate in the sense that I would say that's a strategy. What is our disaster recovery strategy? And having the appropriate information to recover effectively. So you can see it's really all of the necessary information necessary to recover that technical environment to support the business function. Now, often we suggest that there are multiple plans associated with this. There may be a high-level strategy, an order of recovery, high-level dependency, communications, all of those type of things as it relates to the IT side or the technology that's going to be recovered. And then there are plans for each technology or environment or potentially application depending on the situation. Some of those can be combined where appropriate. For example, you may have a storage plan, or you may have a virtual infrastructure plan to make sure that that's in place and recovered, and then the applications may be more of a validation, and we'll talk about that. But having just one big plan is not necessarily a good thing, and I have had clients say, we want one document. And we try to explain that that's probably not the most efficient way to do things. Either way, even if it is possible to do something more in a single document or a single place, both these high-level and these individual plans should be formal, they should be documented, they should be reviewed, and they should be used, and not just something that's put away. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can do some of that in some of these exercises, or some of these strategies and exercises. And then lastly, a plan really isn't good, or the documentation really isn't good, if it's not being updated regularly. We suggest at least annually, but also upon significant changes in the environment. So if you do a major upgrade to an environment, whether that be technology or application, databases, if they go for a significant rev update, you may probably want to review those documents and make sure they're still accurate. You know, one of the things that I have seen in my time with clients is they only get updated at exercise time. And there are significant changes that happen, and the fear there is if something happens outside of the exercise, the documentation really is not as beneficial as it could be. So that's kind of how we look at these, the what is a plan. So then the question is, well, why even bother, right? We're busy. There are a lot of activities. There's a lot of strategic activities that are going on, taking people time, and the chance of us ever using these plans are very, very slim, right? And we understand that, especially if we're at hardened data centers. It's unlikely that a massive type of storm is going to take us out, but it does happen. So the why? Well, one is we just said, well, there really isn't DR. We're moving everything to the cloud, and the cloud is DR. It's going to move auto-magically, if you will. If something goes down, I'll just use the Amazon example. I'm using Amazon for my servers. If it fails, it's automatically going to move. No downtime. I don't have to worry about it. Well, that's true, but we'll get into a little bit of detail there. Our technology team, they know what to do. Why bother having them document it? They know how to recover. They do this every day. Or, look, we're smart people. We'll figure it out. And then lastly, and we see this a lot because of what we've done from a technology perspective, it's really automated. There's no reason to document it. I hit a few buttons and it's scripted and everything goes. So those are probably the arguments against really spending a lot of time on documentation. But what's the detail behind that? Well, in reality, DR isn't dead. It's changed. We're not doing things in data centers with backup tapes and building from scratch, but often our events are self-inflicted. So think about some of the recent airline outages that we had, several months ago, right? Or unanticipated events, not necessarily natural disasters, but other things, terrorist attacks, other types of power issues. I can tell you that one example I love to use that I spoke to someone about was they had a data center where a water main broke close to their facility, and it eroded the bottom of the building. And the next thing they knew, their outside wall was being pushed into their data center racks, and their data center racks started falling over like dominoes. Well, that's really an unanticipated event. Not something that we planned for, but it turned into a disaster and a recovery that they needed to go through. The other thing is we hear a lot is, well, don't worry, our customers will understand if we have an event. And the reality is they won't. Those people who are depending on you won't understand unless they're impacted as well. And I like to use the example of, online shopping. You don't care if it takes a long time or if there's a problem on a website. If they're having a problem, you just want to do your shopping, you're not affected. They should be prepared for that. And we're seeing more and more of that with customers. They have multiple options. Something to consider there. Your team will know how to execute, right? People are good at what they do every day, but they don't recover on a day-to-day basis. So the tasks and the skills that they need are a little bit different when we recover. Also, people will be tired. And we know that when we're tired, we don't make as good decisions and we don't think as well. And more than likely, because you're going to be doing things maybe over a 24-hour period or multiple 24/7 period, you may be using secondary resources, people who aren't quite as familiar, contractors, and they're not going to have that institutional knowledge. And so having some important documentation is going to make things much more effective and will tell them how to execute. The figuring it out part. Sure, people will know how to figure it out, but time is of the essence, and your RTOs and RPOs are often based on, best case scenario. You don't add a whole lot of extra time for figuring things out, and because there will be unexpected issues, you're going to need to be as efficient as possible. And so, spending time figuring out something that you could have noted ahead of time will really save the recovery time. Also, the reality is our recovery environments are often slightly out of sync with production, which is going to take time to figure out what needs to be done. So the figuring out, while it will have to happen, why add additional pieces that aren't necessary? So with all of that, we decide that, okay, we really do have to do this. It really is important, but let's not take a ton of time to do that. How can we do that in a most efficient way? The big thing is to use current documentation. You know that it's probably out there. It may not be perfect, it may be lacking, but there's got to be some type of documentation out there, whether it be from previous implementations, whether it's from audit issues that have gone on, anything like that. It's really useful to use testing information as well. You can leverage your projects, leveraging production changes, implementation and new functionality testing, and all of that are a perfect time to take that information that either is being done currently or has been done, take that and use that for your validation steps, or from your architecture diagrams that people have used for the proposals. I find that the more you dig rather than starting from scratch is very helpful. Also, we tend to reference a lot of that documentation where appropriate, so that you're not recreating it or regenerating it, but put it into the same location and reference it in your plans. For a couple reasons. Then it also helps from a maintainability perspective. When those documents change, you don't have to go change your disaster recovery plan. Also, a big thing that we've been doing lately, especially with some of our clients who are extremely human resource limited, is we end up documenting during exercises. We don't worry about putting together a ton of documentation ahead of time. They might put together, a little one-pager on what they're going to do so that they have the process, but we'll now spend the time pulling screenshots or having another individual sit down, monitor what people are doing, and take a lot of notes so that we can then put that into the DR plan after the fact. They've already dedicated time to the exercise, adding a little bit more time to pull details that need to be put into the documents or documenting it during the wait times can be very effective, a very effective use of time, and it's very current because they've been doing it right then, and so it's not theoretical, it's actionable. And then also, really think in terms of a phased approach. Go ahead and start at a high level. If you just get the strategy and the basic steps down, that's better than nothing. And having something in place in case of an event is a lot better than just having a page with a title on it, or spending 6 months because people are going through and putting all of the detail there, but for 6 months there's nothing in place. So it also kind of helps develop that culture of constantly updating rather than this being a program or a project that I finished the documentation, I don't have to deal with it anymore. It's over, which then it becomes outdated, and you go through it, every year or every 2 years of this massive effort to update the documentation. So we kind of talked about this in general, but looking at these kind of specifically, right? As you can see, modifying that documentation for production changes and implementation. Especially the technology testing and validation. We know that's happening on a regular basis. Pull that out, put it into the documents. The architectures that we find are helpful, especially for those who are not familiar with the environment, are especially helpful to put into the test or into the documentations. And we'll talk about maybe the best place to put those here in shortly. We talked about the DR test. And then, current documentation that you just have sitting out there that may be useful. What we find is this is especially useful for architecture and server and storage details, because that tends to be available. Often they put that together for either for capacity planning or for purchasing decisions or whatever. The other thing that you probably have that is sometimes not thought of in terms of disaster recovery plans from a technical perspective are who is responsible for the various functions. Do you have only specific people who can do Oracle work? Are there only specific folks that deal with Windows or Linux or other operating systems or environments? But you want to make sure you know who that is, because internally they know, but externally, there's just one phone call that's made to the help desk and then it gets solved. So that information can be very, very important. And that's typically kept somewhere, whether it's in your HR system for phone numbers and contact information, or talking with individuals or getting some org charts that you can kind of see. So a lot of times that can be very helpful. So let's talk a little bit about the content. The whys and everything's important, but when it kind of comes down to it, what should be in there, right? And we want this, as we mentioned at the beginning, we want this to be very functional and actionable. So you can see one of the first things that's included in there is institution and technology-specific information. The the method to perform, I'll just use an SRM recovery or whatever your tool is, that can be found usually on the internet, right? You can go out to the vendor site and pull down the manual if you had to. What isn't there is how you've implemented that. What are the server names? How is the storage configured? What is the end state going to be? When I was performing recoveries, one of the things that we would put in there is we would put the snapshot of the expected state of the file system, how much space was expected to be used. And the reason for that was we, in some of our databases, would pre-allocate the database. So our file systems showed more than 90% utilized. Well, in a lot of cases, that could be a red flag for somebody saying, oh my gosh, we have a problem, or is that right? Is it not right? That doesn't seem accurate. And so we end up spending time, as we talked about, figuring it out, when in reality, putting that information up front to say, here's the expected state, so that somebody can look at it very quickly and go, yep, that's right, there's no time being spent. Or important institutional knowledge, right? There's exceptions to how we have implemented this from the standard. That can be very important, especially if you get contractors in who may be familiar with the tools, but don't know how you have implemented those. Because of the complexity between integrations and the integration between systems, that's something that we tend to see is probably missing in many, many plans. The assumption often is, and I hear this, it will work. We've already got it built. We just have to bring the server up. That's true. And in most cases, we keep IPs the same, and we keep the configuration the same. And so it's a decent assumption, but it may not be an appropriate final decision. Understanding those important integration points. How are things communicating? Are they file-based? Are they API-based? Are they web services? Do you have direct database connections? All of that can be extremely helpful if something isn't working, rather than, again, trying to go figure it out. And then, next, we kind of talked about that special configuration, which we kind of discussed, but also validation of all of those things. Again, we have in IT kind of been probably not only our greatest ally, but our greatest enemy. We have made things what I like to call Windows install base. Everything is click a button for install, or click a button and it all happens. We don't go through these builds anymore. We've automated it. We have a button click, and you can have a server in the cloud and stick in a CD and install it, and we're running. So we've made things easy, but we've also kind of taken out the validation portion. If it shows green, we assume everything's fine. And those validation steps across the board, from what the servers, storage, networks, applications, what should they look like in the state that they are in production? Again, because once they're installed and they're working, we typically don't look at those anymore. We're dealing with the next project, or we're only troubleshooting when something goes wrong. And so that information's just not in our head. So validation is absolutely critical. I always encourage 15 minutes of validation can save 2 and 3 hours of troubleshooting up front, after the systems have been turned over. The architecture information that we talked about, that referenceable information can be critical. I've had a client in the past that even the IT team did not know how things interacted. So not only your technical architecture, but also your application architecture, even at a high level. How do these servers interact? What servers talk to each other? Even if you don't know which applications are running on them, that would be ideal. But you know that server X and server Y have to communicate for this environment, and it's FTP based or whatever the technology based is. Understanding both of those low-level architectures and higher-level architectures help in the troubleshooting and help in the overall understanding. So including that as a reference, we think is very important. And then lastly, who is needed, whether that be by actual individual, if appropriate, but also from a skill set perspective. These are the people that need to be involved. We need to have database administrators perform these steps. We need to have the Unix administrator do this. Or it doesn't matter because it's so clear, or it's straightforward enough that any of those team members could do it. But getting down to that specific information can be important. Again, my emphasis here is the special information that needs to be done, not just the regular step-by-step tasks that you can find in manuals. And then the content we like to focus on in all of that is based on actual event and not testing. A lot of times what we see is these documents are based on the testing that's going to happen as opposed to what reality is going to be. And I know that seems very straightforward and maybe obvious, but that focus is really, really important. Include everything that you need. We will see documents that come up, and I'll ask a question about, does this include all of the servers that you would need to perform in a real event? And I'll hear especially things in like load balancers or Citrix environments, or even in bigger environments where they'll have 2 app servers and a database server, and they'll go, well, we actually have 5 app servers in the environment for load balancing, but we only need 2 for testing. Okay, but is 2 going to be enough when you do this for real? Oh no, it would kill our performance. Well, then we need to include all of that in your plan, but maybe for testing we can back that off or mix and match. And so that idea of documenting for testing versus documenting for real events, it can be important to put that documentation for testing at the back of the plan so that it can be referenced, but not up at the front. Also, think in terms of third-party dependencies, especially now for cloud-based computing, the various SaaS providers that we have. There also may be other support individuals that are included in your organization. Again, we often think that, well, that's just a network connection. Well, that may be well and true, but not understanding necessarily how those connections happen or what is necessary. Is it a VPN connection? Is it just an internet connection? Is it a special web service? Are there special keys that are needed? All of those type of things, need to be included, and that's probably more important than here are the steps I have to do to execute the actual recovery, because that will happen, but not having some of those dependent keys and other items will just shut everything down. The server will be functioning, but there will be no communication. And then as we've kind of talked about, integration, communication between your recovery sites. Is that going to be different? Everything's working from your various production sites, whether it be your data center and all of your remote sites. But what happens when you move? Are you sure that your network is set up appropriately? Again, is there any special kind of direct connection, VPN connections? Is there enough bandwidth between them? You've only assumed that you've been doing backup and recovery. All of a sudden now you've got 1,000 people trying to hit that site, and is your network burstable? Now, all of those type of, that's kind of a strategy part, but documenting what you have in place will help you understand and then deal with potential communications if you know that you have to increase that bandwidth, or you need to add some additional hardware at your recovery site, or spin up some additional servers in your cloud environment. Will help you kind of put that in place and have those decision points available. We talked about a lot of these, but to kind of be re-emphasize, right, the specific requirements that you have, right? What can be confusing? Naming conventions. A lot of times our naming conventions are generic, as they should be, because things change. But if you do have special naming conventions, you may want to put those things in there so that it's clear what people are dealing with. Supporting technologies that we talked about. Manual steps that you are going to have to put in place. For example, I was having a conversation with a client about some of their monitoring tools. Well, their monitoring tools are going to come up later. So the monitoring that they do for their environments isn't going to be automated in, maybe the first 3 to 4 days. Well, you still are going to have to do some type of monitoring, so you're going to want to put those type of steps in place for your recovery. How are you going to do that? How many people do you need to do it? Where do they need to be? That can be critical information so that you can keep things running as smoothly as possible. Any exceptional processing, especially when it relates to the technology environment. Do you have to change your backups? Is performance going to be impacted? What about availability? Will you, because of your changes in backup or performance, maybe certain things will be a little bit later. Your interfacing may run a little bit delayed. It won't be quite as in real time. Those type of things to determine and document will then just help in the communication, and then potentially correct as the event is going along. Validation. We talked, kind of introduced this a little bit, but what is your expected usage? So you have servers spun up, but you know that normal is 50%, and you see 75. Well, knowing what normal should be then gives you a chance to determine, do we have a problem or don't we? Or is this because we're running on less equipment or not quite as up-to-date hardware, right? Especially in our cloud environment or our virtual environment. How many servers per VM host do we expect to be running? That could be very important for the management, especially on the performance side. Services and processes. This, to me, is, again, a very important thing to include in your documentation, because the assumption is, well, the server started, so all the services started, or all the processes are running. And we know that just isn't true. I can tell you time after time after time, working with organizations where the server's up, it's green, everything looks good, and then we start to test, and something doesn't work. And you go in and look, and sure enough, an interface service didn't start up correctly, and you have to start it up. Well, again, understanding that that's what should be running and spending the 15 minutes to just go through that look actually would have saved an hour of troubleshooting, because it turned into, well, is the communication not there? Is it, do we have a networking issue? Are the IPs right? We spent all of this time, when in actuality it was very easy. The service wasn't running, because the assumption was, well, the service is running because the server is up. Those type of things can just be incredibly easy, because it's a screenshot of this is what should be running, to just assuming. So I think I've hit that validation. The other part of validation that can be very helpful is the functional validation, and whether that be with the IT team or maybe some personnel, power users or individuals that you use for testing from the non-IT business units. Having some of that up front can be a really nice additional validation to make sure that at least maybe a smoke test is done. I know we all log in, but running through some quick basic functions give you a good sense that the application is either performing as expected from a speed and screen movement perspective, just as well as kind of watching how the underlying infrastructure is running before turning it over maybe for formal business validation. So that can also be a very important step, and often doesn't need to take very long. We've spoken about integration, but a little bit more detail on that, right? What type of integration do you have? You may say that everything's automated, everything's an API these days, or everything is a web services, and then as you dig in a little bit, you'll find there's still this really one important interface that never got converted in its file base, or with this other smaller vendor we still have this FTP based or this VPN connection that we have, and not having that documented can cause time and problems with synchronization of data. What's the timing of the data movement? When should that happen? Is it in real time? Is it scheduled? People may think it's real time because in their process it might be they only deal with things every 15 minutes until it appears real time, when in reality it's every 5 minutes or it's every 10 minutes. And then when you start getting into data synchronization issues, well, did everything run appropriately? Can it self-heal? What if it was halfway through its interface or part of it was there? we often assume that it is self-healing, and sometimes it is, but a lot of times it isn't, and so there are errors built up. So looking at that data synchronization, was everything, did everything come down at the same time? What are your steps to rerun? Is it just rerun the entire job or the entire process, or is there any data cleanup that would need to be done? Now, this may be something that needs to go back to other departments, but again, as you dig into exercises and you do more and more testing, we start finding people find these issues rather than looking at some of it up front. We talked about third parties. How are they going to handle moving to a different site? How do you correct data? What do you need to do if data is going to be delayed? All of those types of things. And then also from an integration perspective, communication steps or milestones between departments, between the various application teams, and it might even be between the various technology teams if your organization is large enough. We just had an issue with, this happened to be with a test where the team, it's an organization that has been acquired and it's now a much larger organization. The storage team that manages the storage is different from the team that manages the backups, and is a different team that does the architecture work and the implementation work versus the support work, which is not necessarily unusual for big organizations. Well, because of that, and I didn't know that change had happened, we had an issue with the backups. Backups changed that didn't get communicated, and as we asked the questions, we found it out, and then we had to quickly deal with a change in the recovery, because the way the backups were running would have impacted how we do recovery. So those communication steps and making sure that you have very specific and kind of formal checkpoints with the various teams can be very helpful to make sure that things are not missed, or assumptions that may be valid are still valid. So from the standpoint of organization, we really want to put actionable things at the beginning and have this to be checklist based, right? Reference information, audit information, we put that at the back. We still keep it because it's important, including architectural information. Well, I remember when I started, and the first thing I would do is I would rip off the first 10 pages of a plan so that I could get to the actionable pieces. That's really what we want to put at the top. What is it going to take? So that after you look at the table of contents, if you need that, it goes right through. And this is my first step. Not a lot of narrative, but actual checklist based. I like this Leonardo quote, right? Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. If there's a lot of narrative or a lot of information that's needed, that can be really important and should be in the plan, but really at the back so somebody can reference it, as opposed to having to read through a page of information that isn't actionable. So I think that really has helped. And the clients that we've been working with, they have really liked that, and several of them have said, I want it even simpler. And we have to be a little careful, that we don't take something that really needs to be 10 pages and make it to 5, because we lose important information like we talked about. This is just kind of an example of one of our DR plan table of contents. So you can kind of see there is kind of a description. There's a very quick strategy, so somebody can look at it and say, well, how is this being recovered? And that might be 2 or 3 sentences. It's not a long description. And then we get right into recovering the infrastructure, action steps, operating system, functional, everything is just boom, 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 boom. And then at the back we start seeing, what is the hardware mapping? What are the recovery times? What are the roles? What do we need to do? So that it's there, but it's not at the very front. Sometimes I found that our documents have turned into audit documents versus actual plans. So we need to keep the audit information there, but we think we can put it at the back. So the integration between business continuity plans and technical plans. This isn't so much because these business continuity plans really are intended to be, what do we do between the time that an event happens and when I can start running normally again, have our functionality back. But there's also going to be changes in locations, and potentially changes in people how they access those environments. So understanding their access methods, how many individuals are going to be needing access, right? Any changes to business processes that could impact processing or your technology needs, right? Security keys, remote access, you know, as much as we hate to say it, the shadow IT technologies, right? What are they saying in their plans they're going to access because it turned out that, you know, the accounting department, we'll just use them as an example, put up a server in the cloud and they put some important database that they developed over there and they use that. Well, you know, IT didn't know anything about that. So some of those specifics can be really important for you to understand, and then it may change your recovery plan a little bit. So reading those and understanding them can be, really is where we see the integration between the business continuity plans and the IT plans, is that information. From a testing perspective on how to make sure that they are functional, we're suggesting on top of our, you know, maybe our big annual test that we kind of see, you know, larger scope, doing more frequent tests with maybe individual or several environments, and making sure that those, at least those localized recoveries work. This is becoming especially easy as we use cloud as a recovery option, or we're using a virtual environment even within our own data centers. Use your secondary resources, and your primary resources, what we call is not available, right? They may be sitting there, but they can't be sitting there helping. They need to be sitting in the back, or they need to be sitting at their desk doing other work, and let those secondary resources try to execute what's going on and fight through it a little bit before the primary person says, oh no, do this and do this and do this. One, it helps understand how clear the documentation is. And two, it gets them some training, but then when it does happen, you can't sit down when, you know, the person with maybe more knowledge says, well, no, we're missing this. Document it right then, right? Put that note in the plan so that it's up to date. And so the clarity of the plans are greatly improved. You may want to do that through a tabletop review rather than an actual execution. Have a secondary resource, just read the plan, and I've had people do this. They go, I have no idea where to even start with this. Well, that's good. That's good feedback. We can go back in and kind of update it to be more clear. You may want to consider a plan review as part of change control. That can be very hard because sometimes we can't even keep our production changes in sync with our DR, but that's something to consider if it's possible. And maybe a plan review as part of a milestone in the project, making sure that, you know, the plan is still updated. That may not work all of the time. It may get, you know, a quick check that, yeah, it seems to be okay, but maybe some important things will still get in there, even if it's not perfect. So, kind of as we finish up here, right, is prioritize based on your environment criticality to start plans if you don't have them. You know, really focus on the recovery task and then validation task, especially those environments that don't have anything. You know, look at your infrastructure, look at your integration, look at your specific information. Also consider your cloud-based environments. How have you integrated those? Don't just assume that because they can be recovered automatically that the integration for them isn't necessary. And then validate your recovery strategy. Does it at least look appropriate? Does it going to work across all of these? A tabletop exercise for that can be very, very useful. But that prioritization, environment criticality, and what doesn't exist is probably a good place to start. So you might want to think about where you can leverage time and content, you know, rather than adding additional tasks, what's already going on. We talked about prioritization. Developing a run book on technologies based on RTOs and resource constraints can be really helpful, especially around those resource constraints, right? If you put your run book together and you're doing 5 applications or 5 technologies with the same person, well, you know that's just not going to happen in parallel. You're going to have to shift that around. So that can be an important piece of your overall plan. Again, I can't emphasize the most, you know, to make things simple and checklist based and limit the duplication of information. If you have it someplace else where it will be updated, just reference it. You may want to keep a copy of it with your DR information, but I wouldn't necessarily insert it into your DR plan per se, because then when it's ever updated, you're going to have to update your plan. And then a couple of other things is, right, something is better than nothing, right? Perfect is the enemy of good. It will never be perfect. There will always be changes. And we want to focus on reality. Can we actually recover, and will this information help us recover? And if it will, that's the information we want to really focus on. And sometimes making things simple is actually harder than making it really, really tough. But once it's there, then it's I think it's more straightforward and easy to maintain and go forward. So with that, we'll open it up. Are there any questions, comments? Really appreciate you all joining. Is there anything that you'd like to ask or maybe take issue with? Okay. If not, as just kind of as a summary, you know, we do have, you know, the documentation is important. It's not more important than recoverability and the technology, but it's important to make that effective. You know, use your current documentation. Really include your special environment-specific proprietary information. If that's the only thing you can get into your plan, that's the most important part. Because in the end, people can't figure out the other pieces, but this information people won't necessarily have in their head. Make it as actionable as appropriate. And as much as we love our auditors, and I do love them because they help me in my job, their information is probably not the most actionable or most important. So include it, but it, you know, help them understand that it's there. It's just it's back for you because we need to make this actionable. And then use your business continuity plans for information to make sure you're not missing anything. We do have, we do have another kind of calculating ROI as it relates to business continuity, your program. In March, Mr. Herrera, the CEO of our company, will be doing that. That can be helpful for those of us that are trying to really help people understand how important doing these tasks are and why it costs a little bit of money. But thank you very much. This will be out on our website for those of you that are participating. You'll have access to this. You've got my contact information. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, thoughts, or if there's anything that we can do to provide that, we will be more than happy to do so. With that, if there are no other comments, I do thank you for taking the time. But if there are any comments or questions, I'd be happy to take those at this time or have a little discussion if you'd like. Okay, well, it seems like everybody is okay. Either it was perfect, or if you think I missed something, I would love to hear your critiques or your comments, so that we can always make sure we're providing good information for folks. So thank you for joining. Have a great rest of the day, and we will hopefully you know, see you at either presentations in the future or you know, see you wherever it may be. And good luck in all of your activities. Thank you very much.